Thank you so much for tuning in to the Living Room Disciple podcast. Today, I'm going to introduce you to Paul Hastings, who's both a husband and a father, and also the host of the Compelled podcast, a podcast in which they highlight the testimonies, the compelling testimonies of believers. It's a pretty amazing conversation that we get to have, and it kind of hovers around both the podcast and also essentially how we are formed when we listen to the testimonies of others. So I can't wait for you all to enjoy our conversation today on the Living Room Disciple podcast, where discipleship finds a home. Paul Hastings, thank you so much for joining us today on the Living Room Disciple podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. It's exciting.
I've been looking forward to this for I feel like it's been on the books for like a month now.
I think it's been like two months. I think actually.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
And one of the reasons I've been looking forward to this is, you oversee an organization called Compelled.
Yep.
And runs a podcast. We'll of course put links to all that in the show notes. But it has kind of a compelling premise, and I think that's what I'm most excited to talk to you about. And how about this? Let's assume that our listeners have never heard of Compelled. What's like the pitch? What's like the high level overview of the podcast?
Sure. So our show is called Compelled, and we find people with unique stories how Christ has transformed their life. We take their testimony and we condense it down into about the most 45 most compelling minutes that we can find, which really illustrate how God is the hero, not the person, not the individual, but rather that Christ is the one who's transforming lives. Then we add sound effects, music, and narration to turn it into a gripping audio adventure. And that's what we do.
Okay, I just need to pause it. Gripping audio adventure. I love that. And I think that's true. I listened to a few episodes of those kind of things. And one of the things that strikes me is when I first heard about it, I wasn't honestly sure how I felt. You know what I mean? I don't know. I was listening to people's testimonies. I was really kind of mixed on.
Sure.
And one of the things we always ask on this podcast is how is this forming me? So I was I don't know if it's going to be a positive formative experience to broadcast testimonies in this way. But that wasn't my lived experience. My lived experience was feeling compelled and gripped and kind of having these moments of my eyes being turned to the Lord and seeing his goodness. And there's this verse that says, I'm trying to remember the reference, but I don't have it right now, that there is power in our testimonies. And I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that that's probably been a theme for you and something you thought about quite deeply in the past. Why start this podcast?
Yeah. So, okay, two answers to that question. First, about power in our testimonies. I think that, and again, I want to make sure that this that what I say here comes across correctly, because I think the important thing to remember is that it's not so much my testimony has some kind of mystical aura about it. Does not. Yeah. But rather, our testimony is actually the story of what God already did, what God is doing currently. And that is actually the powerful component, because it reminds us what God is still capable of doing even in the future. In fact, I just heard a great message. I was at a conference last week, just heard a great message from Exodus, and the Israelites have just been freed from captivity in Egypt, and they've made their way to the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's army comes out after them, right? And so Pharaoh's army is the greatest, hugest, most powerful army on earth, probably that time in history. Yeah. And the Israelites, they're not an army. They're just a bunch of tourists with way too much baggage. Sure. And they're going to die. And they scream out to Moses, and they're so angry at Moses, did you free us just so that we could die out here? Right? There's this element of sarcasm in their voices. And then Moses takes this complaint over to God, and God says, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, God essentially says, be quiet, be still, because I'm going to bring glory to my own self. And then he also says, so that you will remember it for future generations. And of course, I've massively paraphrased that. And that's exactly what happened. So even though the situation was horrible and terrible, and everyone's frightened, and they're we're all gonna die, and it looks awful. The odds are stacked against them, and they continue to get stacked worse and worse and worse and worse against them. Yet God is doing all of it to bring glory to his own self. And so I think that's why our testimonies, it's actually so that we can remember in the future what God has done.
I think it's such a good example too. And right after that, so they cross the Red Sea. They're on the other side. The first thing Moses does is he composes a poem
Yeah.
and a song
Yeah.
for the people to sing and to remember, because there's this power in this Exodus testimony.
Yeah.
And that's like a repeated theme actually throughout much of the Tanakh, the whole Old Testament, is like these moments and these markers that the Lord commands his people to have in order to remember what we would
Yeah.
say today, the testimony of the Lord. And I do think that's one of the beautiful things of what you do. But let me kind of, because we're always thinking about how we're being formed, right? So, one of the things you had highlighted is that you take these testimonies and you do some like creative curation, right, as it
Sure.
were,
Sure.
to
Yeah.
highlight Christ.
Yeah.
So I think a logical, especially in an age of skepticism, right? So I feel like I'm a millennial, so I come from this generation where a lot of us experienced this very, and many of us are still experiencing like a very curated form of Christ, right, in the church.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like how many services can you find right now? Like they don't have a fog machine, right? And so I remember, like it's like I don't know, and we're not knocking that, but I'm saying that there's a lot of people who are engaging with the church and working through their feelings on that.
Yeah.
So I listened to the episodes or some of the episodes, and I felt very good and about the way that you kind of curated things, but how would you walk someone through who is maybe like, I don't really know if I want to listen to a curated testimony. I don't know if that's like authentic or organic enough.
Yeah, yeah. Probably what I would just share with them was like, hey, what we've attempted to do is we've tried to be really authentic. So like people mess up, Christians mess up all the time, even after they are already Christians, and we try to preserve that authenticity in the storyline as well. A good example, I've got a friend, Garrett Kell, and I have got this little card that we actually made for him. And so Garrett, I think we did a pretty good job with that story, where Garrett was a believer, and he had this really cool testimony how he used to be like a party guy, a frat guy, and how the Lord saved him from that while he was in college. And then he became a pastor of a thriving church. And maybe that's where we would, have ended the story if we wanted to be this, rags to riches kind of thing.
Sure.
But what we then did next is we told the rest of the story, which is that as a pastor of a thriving church, Garrett then developed a deep addiction to pornography. And he had this addiction for years that he kept secret from everyone in his life. And we just played it really real and raw. And then we play his story all the way through where it eventually comes to this moment where the entire congregation finds out in one fell swoop by accident, not intentionally on his. I mean, it's just crazy. But that's what really happened. That's real life, what really happened. And then we also play the aftermath of what happened after that as well, and how God still redeemed that story. And so that's our attempt there. So that's just one example, but we're trying we're trying to be true to each person's story. So it's not just all these like, make you feel good sort of thing, but rather like, hey, God is the hero, and some stories don't have happy Cinderella endings, and that's just real life because that's the life that we live in.
And it's something I think we need to talk about as a church more. I think it's one of the reasons that we do a poor job, collectively. I think we often do a poor job of reading through Old Testament stories. I think there's a reason that culturally, like we struggle, and it's because the Old Testament is not meant to like tie a bow on much of anything, right? And so you read like the life of David, and we focus on these like key moments. I mean, but his life ends in this really mixed way with him, like, he's old and he asks for a young woman to be brought into his bed, who he's essentially going to die next to, and he gives Solomon like a hit list to that's how he ends his life. His last words to Solomon are essentially, there's people who I spared. Could you just make sure that they go down to the grave with me? And it ends like that. You're like, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what my clean lesson is, but do we trust that there's still power in the learning about this, the meditating on this, and the processing of this? And I do think that's one of the things about the messy, often ugly testimonies that I carry in my own personal life, and that are like spread throughout the church, that like, you could look at Phil's life and you could cut out certain sections to tell like a beautiful story with an arc,
Sure.
It kind of has, the hero's journey, as it were.
Sure.
But my life is significantly more messy, and a lot of the journeys I've begun ended halfway or
Yeah.
just ended
Or
miserably
they're
because of my
still
own sin.
ongoing because you're only like,
Yes.
30 years old or whatever, right? And like there's still
Yeah.
more happening still. Yeah.
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 And so I really do appreciate that about the content that you all are putting out there as well. So how did you start Compelled? Like, where does this idea come from? I mean, where did it come from? Like, how'd you get started? It's a big step to start a podcast. I know.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. Yeah. So what happened was, for about the first 8 years of my career, I had worked in Texas politics, and that's all I did. I was just a
Oh, that
political
sounds fun.
consultant. Yeah. It was. I mean, it was a lot, and
Yeah.
but what happened over time is that it became all consuming. And
Mm,
so like I was just my brain was just and my heart was just
yeah. Yeah.
completely obsessed by the outcome of political campaigns, and by the success of my candidates. I was being
Mm,
pressured to do things that were probably unethical. I mean, they were unethical,
yeah.
and I was experiencing pressure and desires to do things that were unethical just for the
Mm,
success of our candidates. And then weird, strange things were going on where candidates that were like supposed to be the good guys, you eventually find out like, oh, they actually had an affair with their wife later on, like shortly after you
yeah.
elected them, or like while you were in the process of helping them be elected, they were like doing these things. And so it was
Yeah.
just like really kind of jading all at the same time. And then finally, my wife and I, we had just had our first little baby girl. She was probably about a year old, and I was working, 70 hours a week, and just had no time for the family at all. And at the end of the 2018 Texas primary, my wife and I just looked at each other and we said, we can no longer commit to continuing this type of lifestyle. We need to make a
Yeah.
change. And so we took our first little family vacation, went all across America. We drove up to the Creation Museum in.
Emphasis on little family vacation.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Everything's bigger in Texas, I guess. I
I
don't know.
know, I know. Yeah, so we went to the Creation Museum in Cincinnati, and we went to the Ark Encounter in Kentucky, and we went to the Indianapolis Children's Museum in Indianapolis, and we went to the Christian Worldview Film Festival in Tennessee. Anyways, on this journey, I was surrounded by creative people and things, and I was struck with this idea that of all these candidates and opponents that I had worked for or against over the years, I had never really stopped to pray for my opponents.
Mm,
Like I would pray for
yeah.
favor from my clients. I would never pray
Sure.
for God's blessing on the people that we were trying to defeat ever. I never did that. I never prayed
No.
that God would shape their hearts or change them at all. I was just focused on their destruction. And I
Yeah.
realized like this was a super messed up thing because I realized that God does not care who's on which side of the political aisle. He cares about each person's heart individually and their journey, and no one
Mm,
is too far gone or too lost. And probably through that set of conversations on that vacation, we decided that, hey, why don't we start a podcast about how God is changing people's lives, no matter where they are in that season of life, and how He
mm.
can redeem and restore anybody and everybody. And so that's how we started the show.
That's really beautiful. And um, thank you just for the record for your own testimony right there, right? And I think a lot of us, even though maybe we haven't worked for campaigns, like just that moment of like just stopping and being like, I don't pray blessings over these
Sure,
individuals.
sure, yeah,
And I think that's almost a ubiquitous statement. I think almost every believer in our cultural climate can at least agree to that first season, right? That we've been like that.
yeah.
Um, Let me just ask you this. How did you come to a place of realizing that was a problem? Because I think most people would uh, would not identify that as a problem right now.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if I can claim like, oh, it was like so smart or whatever, or like,
Sure.
or there was like
You're
this
just a
day.
wise guy, Paul.
No, yeah, and it was not like this like immediate eye opener. I think it was probably just through the course of conversations and slow realizations. And
Yeah.
sometimes, like at least for me, like sometimes I feel things before I can really put a finger to it, and then
Mhm.
once someone expresses it, then I realize like, oh yeah, that is exactly
Mhm.
how I've been feeling or what I've been sensing for the last several months. But I just couldn't
Yeah.
really articulate that until, but as soon as they say it, I'm like, oh yeah, that's what I've known, sort of
Yeah.
like subconsciously for the last several months. So I couldn't give you an exact uh, sweet pat little answer there. Sorry.
No, again, it's just the real testimony of like how the Lord works.
That's right.
Sometimes he like has, these vision moments and like Saul becomes Paul.
Yeah.
But oftentimes it's more of just like the slow trotting of life.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and then he's
Absolutely.
working in.
Yeah.
Okay, so help us kind of understand, like, we open up a Compelled podcast. What are we really expecting to listen to and to dive into?
Yeah. So probably the best way to express this is through some samples. So what we do with Compelled is, again, we're sitting down with someone, and I'm capturing probably like a 2 to 4 hour interview with them about their Christian walk and about their faith. And then again, we take that down and kind of whittle that down to the kind of the 45 minutes that I think are really kind of get to the meat or the core of someone's spiritual journey, or their testimony. And at the end, again, we're walking away just trying to celebrate, like, this is what God did. And these are stories that, like, if I am ever struggling, or you as the listener are ever struggling with something else in the future where you're, and we hope that at some point you'll remember, like, you know what? I remember, though, about this one lady I heard about on Compelled, how she too was facing some insurmountable problem, whether it was a marriage that was crumbling or whether it was a child who was dying. And God still worked in that. Maybe the child eventually did die, and perhaps my child may eventually die anyways as well. But even through that, God can still give me hope and peace for the resurrection ahead, and that there's joy to be found in that.
It's really beautiful. We have a clip that I'd love to go ahead and share with our listeners so they can kind of get a sense of what this is like, and honestly tease you all over to check out the podcast. Set up this clip with Hannah for us. Like, what are some things we should know kind of going in?
I'd be glad to. So there's this story you're about to hear is about Hannah Overton. I've got a nice little card right here for anyone who wants to look on their YouTube video. It's there. But Hannah Overton was a mother. I think she had 4 children, and she was in the process of adopting a 5th child. She and her husband were. And this little boy was about 5 years old. And unfortunately, while she was adopting him, he passed away in a rather dramatic fashion. It was really sad. And so, of course, Hannah is grieving. Her husband is grieving. Her other 4 kids are grieving that they lost this little boy who was about to become their brother. And he'd been living with them for months. But out of the blue, Child Protective Services then falsely accuses Hannah of murdering this little boy in cold blood. Oh, wow. And unfortunately, it gets even crazier. And there's a whole backstory of this, and you can listen to it on the podcast. But Hannah is convicted falsely of murder, and the Texas jury has 2 choices. They can either sentence Hannah to death, or they can sentence her to life in prison. And so they chose life in prison. And this story picks up as Hannah has been informed that she is going to spend the rest of her life in prison.
We're going to go ahead and we're going to turn over to that. It is kind of emotional in a beautiful but also very tough way. So we'll put a link in the show notes to the timestamp where it picks up if you need to skip through that.
Because probably I had been raised on a missionary base, I had seen God step in and save the day so many times. I had watched as money was provided the day before something was needed, and I just expected that God would come in and save the day on my time schedule. The morning that I left before my verdict, I didn't even I kissed my kids goodbye, but I didn't prepare them for that I might not come home. I didn't expect that I wasn't going to come home. I had, a 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 7-month-old.
Yeah.
That I left at home with my husband.
The decision was immediately devastating. Hannah had entered the courtroom a free woman, fully expecting to be declared not guilty, but instead was escorted away handcuffed as a convicted murderer. Larry would have to tell their children what had happened to Mom.
He stared out of a window for a few hours, and the kids were with my pastor, and then he was like, I need to go home and tell them, and he just told them that some people believed some lies about me and that I had to go to jail until we could prove the truth.
Hannah was immediately sent to county jail and locked away in solitary confinement. Because of the nature of her conviction, she could never have physical contact with her children ever again. God had abandoned her. Or had he?
I was in complete shock, and I don't remember the next 5 days. I was totally in shock. My attorneys came to the police station with me, and they tell me stories of in the county jail, the sheriff actually let them stay with me for hours, and I was crying, I can't do this. A few weeks later, there was a point when I was very, very depressed. As we spoke about a little bit earlier, I had thought God was going to come in and save the day, and he didn't do that. In my perspective, God had failed.
Yeah.
And I was trying to figure out how God could love me and allow this to happen to me.
Yeah.
And I was in solitary confinement because of all the media for the first 5.5 months. And I was alone. I was only allowed out of my cell to shower in the middle of the night. And I was very, very depressed. I wasn't eating. I wasn't sleeping. Every time I would try to go to sleep, I would have nightmares that I couldn't get to my kids and they were hurting. And so the nightmares were even worse than it was when I was awake, so I was scared to go to sleep. Because in my dreams, they would be like drowning in a car and I couldn't get to them or whatever, different things like that.
Yeah.
And anyway, I had come to a point where I just felt like I couldn't do it anymore. And I was planning to call my husband to tell him, because I got a phone call every so often in the middle of the night when I could call him and talk to him for a few minutes. And I was going to call him to tell him that I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and I was getting sicker. And my plan was, I wasn't telling him I was going to kill myself, but I was telling him I was going to die of a broken heart. So I called him, or I went to try to call him. And little did I know that earlier that day, God is so cool, because my son was trying to go to sleep and he was crying. My oldest, he's 8, and he was crying. He was telling his daddy, I can't do this. I can't do this. And how can I live without my mama? And Larry left him. And he said, can you just read this right now? Read your Bible for a minute, and I'll be right back. And he left because he didn't know what to say. He was completely overwhelmed by that question. And he went to the garage and cried. And when he went back in, Isaac was not crying anymore. He was smiling. And he said, Daddy, look. And he opened up his Bible that Larry had told him to read for a minute. He says, it says right here, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And in that childhood faith, he read that and he believed that, and he said, we can do this.
Yeah.
And he said, you need to tell Mama when she calls, tell her that the Bible says we can do all things. And so when I called, ready to tell Larry that I was going to, die of a broken heart, before I got that out, he was able to tell me that story about how, God says in his word, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
Wow.
And, that helped carry us through.
It became clear that God was ready to meet Hannah every step of the way. Whenever she needed him most, he was there.
I was throwing a fit one day. I was, just telling God how unfair it was. How can you say you love me and I'm in this prison and my babies need me, my husband needs me, I need to be home. In the midst of this fit, I wore myself out crying, and the last thing that I said to God was, I can't even see the flowers, and I fell asleep. Well, God loved me so much that even in the midst of that fit, where I'm telling him he doesn't love me, he heard that, and a friend of mine woke up in the middle of the night with this intense desire to get me flowers. And she tells her husband, I've got to go get her flowers. And he's like, you can't. She's in the county jail. You can't get her flowers. She's like, no, I have to. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but I have to. And after a bit of an argument, she got up and went to the grocery store and bought flowers and went to the county jail and was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with these, God, but I feel like you told me to buy flowers. And she put them in the no parking sign. And little did she know, I was on the 6th floor, but when I looked out my window, that's what I could see. That my little bit of the real world that I could see was that no parking sign. And I looked down the next morning at those flowers. It's like, now I look back and, it makes me want to cry that God bought me flowers at the time.
Yeah.
I was still a bit of a brat in the mood I was in, feeling abandoned by God. And I was like, that's not funny, God.
After almost half a year in solitary confinement in county jail, Hannah was transferred to a maximum security prison where she was introduced to another world.
What was your communication with your family?
About once a month, my husband would bring the kids up for a 2-hour visit through bulletproof glass. He came every weekend. The church helped pay for gas and watch the kids and all kinds of stuff so that he could come. And he came every weekend, and we had contact visits, so we would sit at opposite sides of a table, but we could hold hands. But because my case involved a child, I couldn't have that with the children, so I had to see them through bulletproof glass, and he brought them up once a month.
Slowly, Hannah began to adjust to her new life in prison.
So over the next few months, as I began to heal and I began to to get used to life in prison and what the day-to-day was going to be like, I felt like God was saying to me that in his hands, I had a big purpose. And he had a purpose for what he was doing. And I needed to trust him. I might not understand his plan, but I needed to trust his heart. There was this lady, and at the time, she was the head of the Wiccan Circle, and she was
in prison.
The
Wiccan Circle.
The Wiccan Circle, and she was very, very scary, very dangerous. And I was put in a job where she was supposed to train me, and she was very angry with me because I kept crying, and she's like, "You can't cry in prison," Except she didn't say it that nicely, but so she kept, she kept yelling at me for being a crybaby. And finally one day she said to me, she said, "You need to get over this, and you need to realize that this is your home." And I was like, "This will never be my home." And she said, No, this is your home." And she said, "Now you say that you believe in God, right?" I said, "Yeah." She's like, "So if your God is so powerful, then he's got some purpose for you being here, or he wouldn't have put you here. So either you believe in him or you don't. Is this your home or not?" And I was mad at her. I was like, "How could you say that to me? This is not my home." And so I went back to to my dorm after work, and I was telling God all about how this wasn't fair. And I opened up my Bible, and in Acts, there's a place in Acts that says that God decides exactly when and where you are to live. And I opened it up to that scripture, and I was like, "Oh, wow." Okay, God.
Yeah.
And it was like God was telling me, I am in control, and I did decide exactly when and where you were to live.
Yeah.
And you have to give in and realize that this is my plan for you right now. And there's a purpose. And so at that point, I repented for being so upset, and I was like, "I don't know that I can ever call this home, God, but I understand that you have me here, and that there's a reason for you having me here."
All right. Whoa. So help us kind of process through that story, but also, is this normal? Is this the type of story you normally are listening to and listening to people processing through?
Yeah. So just to kind of take a step back there with Hannah's story, we end on this cliffhanger. She's still in prison, but now she realizes, like, is this where God actually wants me to be? And the answer is yes, this is where because God never makes accidents, right? You think about Joseph, you think about Daniel, both of those guys were wrongly placed in completely different situations where they should, quote unquote, never should have been. And yet they're in these foreign empires, and God uses them to become men of influence to preserve his country or his people. And same thing with Esther also. But in particular, like, for me, and this might be odd, when we listen to stories, and I'm listening to, people's testimonies all the time, I just find it really uniquely encouraging to me. And maybe it's like my personality type.
Sure.
But to be able to sort of like sink in with somebody and fully sort of experience what they were going through at that time. But then to realize, like, but God is going to win the day. And it may not be the way that I want, right? Like, maybe Hannah's going to stay in prison for the rest of her life anyways. Maybe she'll be there forever. But it's still, God is still the winner, because God is still working in these situations. And we just have to wait and see sometimes. And maybe we won't see the nice, happy ending here on earth, but in heaven, all things will be restored. All things will be redeemed. Everything will be set new, and God is the winner.
You've said this a few times, and I want to hone in on it. And this is really the crux of this podcast specifically. I want to know, how do we become more or less like Christ when we make a habit in our lives of listening to the testimonies of others, right? Like, that's kind of like where I kind of want to go. So one of the fears I have is that, man, if I make a habit, we live in a culture that beautifully, in some ways, like we have mental health conversations more frequently maybe now than we have before. I feel like just maybe me in past roles, I'm thinking of especially pastors out there, we listen to people's stories so much, we can get empathy fatigue, we can become, so tell me, like, what's the desire as people listen to the stories from Compelled, but also just in general, in our living rooms, as it were, we're listening to the stories of our friends and our family, and listening to what Lord's been doing in their life. How should we be formed ideally?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really deep question. I'm glad you asked that, because sometimes I think we could just kind of hear something, and then we just jump on and move right on beyond that. Probably what comes to my mind actually is 2 Corinthians 5:14 and 15 actually, which in essence, I think it says something to the effect of, for the love of Christ compels us, since we've reached this conclusion, one died for all, therefore all have died. He died for all, so that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for the one who died for them and was raised. And really, it's this idea that our stories, all of our stories now should be reflecting this idea that God is the reason that we're even alive in the first place, spiritually speaking, right? It's Christ who died for us. And now his love for us now should compel the entire way that we live our lives. And so even when we hear someone else's testimony, again, we're trying to extract this emotion from that testimony. Like, hey, here's something crazy happened. God is the winner. And now this person you just heard, it's totally transformed the way that they live their life. They are now compelled to live for Christ, right? Because they've reached this conclusion. They've recognized the truth of that passage from 2 Corinthians. And so now we too, hopefully we can gather that without having to actually experience that thing. Like, I don't want these things to life in prison, right? But I do want to walk away with being compelled. Again, I think about the Old Testament is replete with stories, and not all of them have the pretty endings, but many of them are stories of faithful men who loved the Lord. Daniel, who stood up in the lion, was thrown into the lion's den because he was willing to die for his faith. His friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All these stories that we teach our little kids, but those resonate with our little kids because our little kids remember and latch onto stories right away. And it's I think a story can be a way to sort of bypass a longer teaching method to get to a conclusion in your heart. But at the same time, you need to look back though, and then reinforce those things with actual teaching and thought and deep processing. But stories are a way, in 45 minutes, man, you can slam somebody right into the emotion. They can walk away. That's like movies, people love watching feature films because you experience a story in 90 minutes. And you can convey something in 90 minutes that in a book might take you, 10 hours to process.
And I think to some extent what you're just talking about, not just the condensed part, but also just the idea of just people's stories in general. And I think about this a lot too, because in communities, just like anything else, we shouldn't only be having spiritual formation conversations when we're listening to this podcast. We shouldn't only be hearing testimonies when we're listening to Compelled, right? There should be a habit in our life of being in community and looking at someone in the eyes and asking, what's your story? And just listening and being curious. And one of the things that I was thinking about kind of in preparation for this conversation was, I am listening to stories all the time. Turn on the news, just turn on Netflix, whatever it is, whether it's a blatant story like a show, or it's just the story of life. This is the war across the ocean. This is the issue experienced within my own borders. This is the tragedy that happened down the street. These are stories, and many of them are true stories. These are the difficulties. Even the fictional stories are conveying truths about the world that we live in a fallen world. And I sometimes think about the power that's in testimony. It can, I don't want to limit God. God's not in a box. So it can be, just miraculous in a sense. But in a sense, the miracle is in the slow forming of my own mind and the story I tell myself. That, to your point, it's I begin to reinterpret my story as the main character is Christ, and we're glorifying, and we're pointing to him, right? I create a habit of that. I create a habit of victory, even when all the world, my situation is not victorious by the world's standards, right? I'm in prison, or this loved one is still gone, or this thing that I was praying for did not happen, whatever that is. How many of us, for example, have found beauty in the letter of the Philippians, the letter that Paul wrote to the church of Philippi, and we find beauty in it. But then, like when we learn that Paul, like we highlight the fact that Paul's like talking about, like he's in prison when he's writing this letter of joy, like that element, that little bit of background where he's like, I'm in chains, but I'm like, you're like, what? And it's like that narrative of like Paul finds joy even in the midst of chains. And so what I'm trying to say is, I think we're kind of formed to be like Christ because we start to reinterpret our own story as one in which Christ is the main character. Does that resonate with you at all?
I think so. Frequently people reference this passage from Revelation 12:11 that they and I'm trying to remember. It's essentially it's like and they it's you may have to edit
We're
this
going to Google it.
Yeah. But it's like they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their
testimony. Yeah.
And they love not their lives even unto death. And I think sometimes people can actually maybe misquote that passage, being like, "Oh, the word of their testimony and the blood of the Lamb." It's sort of like equating the two, like, "Oh, it's this and that, and that's what conquers us." It's the blood of the Lamb. I don't think that's the right interpretation. I think it's that the blood of the Lamb is the thing that conquers. The blood of the Lamb is the blood of Christ, right? And the word of their testimony, I think that's more of a reinforcement statement, saying that the word of their testimony, the way that they lived their lives, sort of was like in submission to, because it's the blood of the Lamb. So back to that 2 Corinthians passage, that the blood of the Lamb, the death of Christ, that is what shaped everything else that we do now. And so when we talk about the word of their testimony, the idea is the saints, the church, has embraced this to such a full extent that even the way they live their lives, their testimony of their life now is reflective of it's because Christ died for us in the first place. I'm not a theologian, so I couldn't wax super eloquently on that, but I believe that to be true.
Aren't we all just armchair theologians? But to your point, though, I think not just about it also kind of gets into the bones of how we act. So thinking about that verse where the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony, there's some extent that the word of the testimony, your testimony is a result of the blood of the Lamb, right? So like because of Christ's work on the cross, I have a testimony at all. Yeah. And I think about what does it say? Blessed are the beautiful are the feet that carry the good news, and it's in this section in which it says that Paul writes that. We get this idea of like, well, how are people going to know if people don't go? Like, how are people going to know what Christ has done if people don't go and tell them? And maybe I'm wrong as well, but there's this always kind of been this feeling in me that Christ's work on the cross was enough. Then he's commissioned us, is the term that's often used, to go and talk of that work, and I think to communicate that work in our, like, in what it's been doing in our own lives, right? This level of like, this is the work that Christ has done on the cross. This is how it's influenced me as an individual. The focus is on him and the glory is for him. And the end of the story is one in which he comes and there's a new kingdom and a resurrection in which all things are made new. But there's this like, nobody's going to know what Christ has done in Phil's life until Phil tells somebody what Christ has done in my life. And when I start thinking, I hear the stories of others, I form this mental pattern of like, this is what a testimony is. It's the work of Christ in someone's life. And I begin to highlight that and I begin to see that in my own life. Then I begin to live as if that is true. Like I live with faith. We talk a lot about anxiety and fear, which I think is obviously very real. And it's something that many people who are listening to this podcast are struggling with. And then there becomes this question of like, is it possible to live without fear? I think it's a big question that our society is asking. And if we consume testimonies often, and that becomes the narrative that's kind of rattling around in our brain all the time, I feel like things like faith increase and our actions that are born of faith increase, and fear naturally dissipates and actions that are born of fear naturally dissipate. Of course, there's exceptions with the chemical imbalances in our brain that can cause certain emotions, but I think generally that's a good rule of thumb. Am I rambling? I'm rambling at this point. I'm pretty sure.
Hey, we went from like armchair theologians, and now we're kind of getting into like a neuroscience here, and like who knows, next we'll be constructing aircraft for the space race or something.
Paul, where do you pray Compelled goes from here?
That's a great question. My wife and I have been talking about this for a while. So we started the show about 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And we were recently, about a year ago, we were able to go full time on the show. So it's kind of grown a lot. And so we're excited about that. We've talked about launching a podcast network, actually, which may happen sooner rather than later.
All right.
We're discussing with other podcasters right now that are kind of in the same space of immersive storytelling from a Christian perspective.
Yeah.
So that might be something in the works right there. Another thing that we just recently did on our website is we actually created a topical page. So if you head over to our website, compelledpodcast.com, up in the top bar, you'll see topics. And that way you can actually look for specific topics that are relevant to the Christian walk, whether it's about suffering or how does a Christian respond to pornography or when a loved one dies or loss, different topics. And then in those topical pages, we list some of our particular episodes or testimonies that were specific to those topics of choice. And you can listen to those. But we also highlight books and articles and resources that we found to be really helpful in those topics as well. So we're hoping that's helpful resources to pastors and to lay people as well, or to general listeners that are trying to find things. So we're trying to populate those pages right now and point people to good resources.
We're absolutely going to put notes or links to all those in our show notes. And let me end on one last question. Paul, how do you think that you have changed with Compelled and listening to the testimonies of person after person after person?
Yeah, that's a really great question. There's been multiple occasions actually where I've had my wife and I, we've been dealing with something difficult in our marriage where we will then point back and reflect like, actually, this actually reminds us of so-and-so's story. And these people becomes friends with us, actually. They're not just like, out there in the nowhere, sort of like random person. Like we know these people now. I text with them. They're friends of ours. And we can find hope and encouragement just knowing like, yeah, this happened to that person. And yet God walked them through that on the other side. And, we are still in the midst of things. We're still in the thick of it. But we have the fullest confidence of God who would work with that person. And we know from the word that he can work with us as too.
Paul, thank you so much for the work that you're doing with Compelled. I pray in blessings that it continues to grow. And I encourage those who are listening to check out the podcast and to make a habit of hearing testimonies, whether that's listening through Compelled and also being in local communities in which you're looking at people in the eyes and you're hearing their stories and you're being curious about them. So thanks for modeling that, Paul.
Oh, glad to. It's our honor, man.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode of the Living Room Disciple podcast. I pray that my conversation with Paul was a blessing to you. Make sure to check out the show notes where you can find more about the Compelled podcast, about the work that they're doing, and the episode that we listened to just a snippet to earlier. Also, don't forget to check out livingroomdisciple.com where you can find out more about us and how you can support us on Patreon. Thank you so much to Anissa Leib for all the amazing production work that she does, to Eric Church for getting this episode out into the world, to Daniel Ramirez for composing all the music for this episode. And thank you to you. Thank you for listening and for supporting and for being a part of the Living Room Disciple community, where discipleship finds a home.